welcome to another episode of Revenge Motion Graphics, Reverse Engineering Motion Graphics, and today we're going to do another widget, this time based on Ender's Game. There's a good amount of FUI HUD design in that film, and here's one of the elements. Okay, so a somewhat less advanced widget than the previous tutorial, and let's go ahead and get started here. So the first thing I will do is I'm going to go ahead and show you some of my settings here. Again, I'm just using 720p. I'll make the background black here. I'll go ahead and start making these sort of call out lines here that are on either side. So let's do that first. So again, this is going to be a lot of shape layer technique here. So let's try to make most of those things with the shape layers. So first thing I'll do is I do want to give myself some guides. So keeping an eye on this section, I want to do half of my composition, and I'll keep this at 100% for right now. And I'll do half of my composition, which is 360 by 640. Give me some good guides here for my center, and then I'll lock everything down. And then bring this back up again. Give me some timeline room here, and let's go ahead and grab a shape layer. So the way I work with shape layers is I like to draw them out to the side and then line them up as needed. So I'm going to go ahead and just make that first element, which is basically something that looks like this. Okay, and this is basically just a line that has 3 points on its path. I'm going to go ahead and customize this, so I'll do a let's make it sort of a mid-gray, and let's make the line about 1 thickness. Okay, and a couple other things we'll do here is I want to go ahead and reshape this just a little bit. So I'll make this slightly longer and maybe more at an angle like this. Okay. Again, I'm referencing the original QuickTime here. So then what I'll do is, I'll go ahead and name these appropriately. I'll just call this callouts. And I'm going to, in that same group, under shape layer here, I'm going to basically add another element here. So I'll go ahead and get rid of fill, and I'm going to grab now an ellipse. And mainly why I'm keeping all of these in this group called shape 1 is that basically so the stroke here will apply to both of them uniformly. Okay, on the ellipse here, I'll just change this, right click and change it to a Bezier path. Gives me a little bit more ease of control here. And then I will kind of line this up so that it's right at the end of that call out. And I can use my arrow keys holding down shift to put this thing into place. So I'll just go in there pretty close and just kind of line this up as best as I can. It doesn't have to be perfect because we'll use that kind of a small element here. Great, so now we have that element pretty much ready to go. And what I'll do is I'm going to start working with my my shape layers here so that I can repeat this shape on the y-axis like a mirror of it. And the way I'm doing this is I'm going to use, let me go ahead and rename shape 1 here to line or something more descriptive like that. And I'll go ahead and add a repeater. Okay, so again, by default it wants to do 3 copies on the x-axis. So what I will do is turn that off. So I'll make 2 copies and I will zero out my position. Now the way I've been working with these lines lately is, you know, I've been zeroing everything out, and if I uncheck the scale uniform here, what I can do on the x-axis is type in -100. So what this is going to do, if you look here, is it's going to be a pretty good mirror image on the other side. Okay, so without having to draw this at an angle, other side, I can just use a repeater to mirror these things. Now, if I need to, I can also change some things around. For example, if I want to put them closer together, all I really have to do is select both of my paths here like this. Somehow I got a keyframe there. Let me turn that off. So I'll do both of these, and if I kind of move them closer together, the other side corresponds. Okay, great. So now we've got these two shapes here. And like I said before, I might need to change them around a little bit. We'll see how that goes. The other thing I can do is, again, add another repeater. So I can go to repeater, grab another one. Again, I'll zero it out on the, I'll keep my copies to 3. I'll zero it out on the X. This time, I'm going to push the Y. So if I keep pushing this down, I can sort of move these down and create this sort of call out section here. Okay, so, and right now this is a little too big. I can fix all that later, but right now I can just move these down. If I increase the copies, for example, I can make a whole bunch of them. Okay, great. And now I can sort of treat them as a group here. So if I need to, I can bring everything up. For example, I could do that on any one of these transforms. I can do it on the line, bring that up on the y-axis, maybe like that. Or I can use a layer itself. I prefer to use it on the transform of the line rather than messing with the layer here. So now I have something that looks like this. Okay, so this is now callouts. Maybe we'll just leave the name of this to callouts. And what I can basically do, trying to accomplish here, is if you look at the example, these kind of almost look like they're infinitely scrolling down into sort of this emptiness here, and then this bottom part picks it back up. So how do I do that? How do I make these sort of almost like a progress bar scroll to these things? So that's the trick I'm going to show you here in a minute. So to get started here, I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose these. So if I go to layer, pre-compose, I'll go ahead and call this callouts, something like main perhaps. Okay, and then what I'll do is I'll immediately go into that pre-comp. Now here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command K, and I'm going to increase the height of my composition here, mainly because I want to capture the entire amount of these things. So here's about 12 copies or so, and I'll go ahead and hit OK. Now, to make these things kind of look like they're infinitely looping, what I need to do is create a tileable, loopable version of these callouts. So how do I do that? So if you're happy with the amount of these, I think I have 12 copies here. Okay, so I can add more copies, but I think I should be okay with 12. So if you're happy with the amount here, what I'm going to do is create a tileable, loopable version. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use guides. I already have some guides here. I'll add a couple more. I'm going to basically put this guide right on top of that circular part there. Okay, and I'll do the same thing on top, because this is, I think, a better, more visible feature for me to cut. So let's do the same thing on top here. Kind of like that. So right on top of that circle. Okay, there. And again, down to bottom there. So now if I go ahead and go to my region of interest, I'll draw out an extra large loose box first. And I will go ahead and reshape the region of interest so that it fits my, so they basically align with the guides here. Okay, one there. And then the same exact section on the bottom of those callouts. So let me see just to make sure. Okay, that should work. Now, composition, crop, comp to region of interest. Okay, now if we go back into our main composition here, apply that same offset. If I scrub the Y, shift center 2, it should be pretty much tileable and seamless. Okay, excellent. Now, let me go ahead and actually animate this so that we're doing that step in real time. So I'm going to go ahead and on the offset the effect at frame 0. Doesn't really matter where, I'll just make a keyframe. These numbers don't matter really in terms of where the starting point is. So I can even reset this. And I'll click stopwatch. Now, you don't want to do blend with just the shift center 2. And maybe I'll go 2 seconds forward. And I'll drag this forward just to see how much offset we're getting. If I play this back, it's not bad. Maybe I will make this, let's say, let's get some nice round numbers here. So here I'll start with 350. Next one I'll do maybe 500. Okay, let's make that 750, just moves faster. Okay, great. Now we're getting some linear animation here, so it's just kind of basically going from point A to point B in a very linear, equal speed fashion here. So I'm going to change that. Before I do that though, I want to go ahead and apply an expression to this to keep this thing constantly moving. So option click stopwatch, type LOOP, loop out, capital O, open parentheses, type equals quote offset. So a couple other ones may work here in terms of the type, but offset seems to work okay. So now if I play this, it'll continuously just loop the entire animation. If I want to make it faster, I can move these closer together, or slower, spread them back out. Okay, great. Now, if you look at the original here, it kind of doesn't really move in a linear fashion. It kind of has a fast, slow movement to it, and that is done in the graph editor. So I'll go ahead and make these easy ease, and then open up the graph editor, and you'll see that if you look at the value version of this, you'll see that the graph editor is showing you easy ease. For this particular example, since this won't let me separate out I'll go ahead and switch this to speed graph. If you're not familiar with speed graph, there are a lot of tutorials online, but basically the way it works is it allows you to sort of create custom speed animation to this. So for example, right now you're looking at an easy ease in speed graph mode. So it's slow, fast, slow. So if I wanted to, I can make it more pronounced. For example, if I do something like this, this is a very fast, then it slows down. So if I look at the animation, it will continuously do that. Okay, again, if you look at the speed graph, and you kind of want to think of the speed graph as miles per hour. So it goes from 0 to 700 pretty fast, then it slows down. Okay, great. So that's sort of the one element here. Now, the next thing I will do is I'll go ahead and add, if you look at the original example here, there's another section here that kind of is a mirror image of the first, although moving the same exact way. So I'm going to create this smaller version first, or next rather. Okay, so a couple of things to keep in mind. I will go ahead and make this smaller a little bit. Push this up. Kind of keep it like that. Okay, now at some point also I'll add a glow to all of this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do that right now so you can sort of see these better on the video. So I'll make a new adjustment layer, and I will add a glow effect to that adjustment layer. and these now stand out a little more, and the other elements will also stand out more for the tutorial so you can see them better. Later on I will adjust this glow a little bit to more make it customized, but for right now we're getting something like this. Okay, great. So what I will do to make these things fade out is I will go into the pre-comp, grab my mask tool, and I will just create a box like this. Now one thing I'm running into here is if I do it right on this callout, which has animation, so this actually has keyframes, the mask is not really going to function correctly. So what I really should do is before applying any masks, I'll go ahead and pre-comp this one more time. So let's pre-comp that. Let's call this callouts upper. Okay, what that is going to do is separate the animation from the mask. So now I can add a mask to this. Set it to subtract, feather, and have it fade away. Okay, so it kind of looks like this. Now if you're getting these sort of areas that are still visible, again, that's just simply working with the mask. For example, in this case, what I'll probably need to do is just to make the mask taller and then have it fade out. Great. Alright, so this works fairly well. So now to make the bottom part, this is callouts upper, I'm going to duplicate this and call the other one callouts lower. Now before I do that, something to keep in mind is inside this callouts upper, if we double click, we have another pre-comp in there. So basically there are two pre-comps. The way After Effects works is if I duplicate something in my timeline, it's going to have a link to the original, meaning that whatever I do to the pre-comp here will affect the duplicate, which I don't want. So what I'm actually going to have to do is duplicate this in my project library here. Okay, so rather than clicking Command D here, I'm going to find this composition, and here it is in my project library. And you can ignore all these because this is from a previous trial and error session. So I'm going to basically do Command D here. Okay, so these two are now duplicates, but they're not linked. So whatever I do to one, the other one won't be affected. And I'm going to rename this one lower. Okay, so we have callouts upper, callouts lower. Now, if I double click inside here, there's also this one, which also needs to be duplicated. So what I'm going to do here is, in order for this to be independent as well, I'm going to basically right click, go to reveal layer and source, just to show you that way you can find things. And again, I'll do Command D here. And this one I'll just keep the name callouts main 2. Okay, now I can go ahead and add callouts lower. So the easiest way to do that is go ahead and Command D here. Okay, remember now these are linked, but if I replace this one with callouts lower, so what I'm going to do is click on this to highlight it, grab callouts lower and hold down the Option key as you drag. It will replace that. And the reason why I'm doing that particular way is because I want these two to be sort of lined up already, and then when I replace the duplicate with the lower, they're not synced and they're right on top of each other, so they're already lined up. Show you what I mean here. I'll go ahead and move it down, and so you have both of these guys right there. Okay, now they are identical, so if I play this back, you'll see something like this. Okay, as a matter of fact, on this one, delete that mask so it's not in the way. But basically we have two that are identical, and more importantly, they're not linked to each other. They're not linked here, and they're also not linked in their inside pre-comps. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. In this one, I'll just even make it smaller a little bit to differentiate it from the other one. Now I'll move this up. Okay, so if I play this now, we have something like that. Now the original example looks a little different. The bottom part has these kind of facing upwards. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to my callouts lower, and remember we also duplicated this up here, so we also need to click on callouts main 02, replace it here. Okay, again, what I'm basically doing here is I want to make sure that these two are not synced to each other or linked to each other. And also, if I go to either one of these, so if I go to callouts lower, for example, I want to make sure that these, in their own respective pre-comp, are also not linked. So callouts upper is not linked, neither is callouts main. Callouts lower is not linked, and neither is callouts main 2. Okay. Now, what this is going to allow me to do is I'm going to go ahead and lock down my composition Ender's Game widget here. Lock that down. Go to callouts lower, and I'll move this over to the right, but actually I'm going to go into further into it, callouts main. So I want to make sure I see callouts main and the main composition called Ender's Game widget. So now I want to see both these together. Okay, and the reason I want to do this is because I want to work on this left side and see it update on the right side. So the easiest way for me to reverse this direction here is I'll just go to the transform of the line. Remember, the line holds my paths, and I'll just do a rotation 180 degrees here. Okay, so now we have the reverse here. Now the problem is it kind of breaks my loop. Okay, so what I'll do again here is I'm gonna reline up my loop so it's looped in the correct way. And what I can simply do is just work with position here. So if I bring this down, if you recall, the loop basically started when it basically hit on this oval part here. So if I bring this down low enough, you can hold down the command button as you do that, I should be able to push that right on that edge to create a loop as well. Maybe something like this. Okay, to check, I can go back up and see that this part also disappears. So that should work. Let me just go back and maybe move down just a little bit more on my position here. Maybe something like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this out. We'll go back into the original here and let's check. And again, I'll go ahead and grab my mask, put it on the lower one. Same thing, subtract. And feather. So now we have something that looks like this. Okay, now if you look closely here, there is some overlap. I'm not going to worry about that too much. I might even move my masks around just a little bit. If I wanted to create a cleaner, I can even lower the feathering here. And I can do the same thing on the upper mask as well. Maybe I'll lower the feathering down. Maybe I'll move this one down just a little bit. So kind of like that, I would say. Works pretty well. Okay, looks great. All right, now these are a little bit too low. So if you look at the original example, my two callouts are in the upper area here. Simple fix, I can just grab both of these. I can probably just push them up. Kind of trying to keep this overlap here in the center. So now I have something that looks like this. Okay, great. Okay, so now we've got those lined up. Let's go ahead and continue to add more elements here. Maybe one other thing I'll do here is on the upper mask, I'll just move it down a little more so that there's a little bit more overlap on there. And maybe I'll lower the feathering even more, maybe like 30. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, let's go ahead and add more elements here. So maybe what I'll do now is if I work on the upper part here, I can add some numbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that. So I'm going to go ahead and double click in the callouts upper. So what I will do is I will go into the section here that kind of started it all, and I'm going to put some numbers on the edges here of all these callouts. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to grab my text tool. I'll just double click, which puts the cursor right in the center. And all I'm going to do is add an expression into the source text. So here's that expression. So if I option click on the stopwatch here, hit Command V, here's the expression. Now this is something that I copied from somewhere online. If you look at, if you do a search for After Effects random 4-digit generator, you should have something that looks like this. So what this is going to do is basically just generate a bunch of random 4-digit numbers. Okay, which is all good and fine, but I want to have a, at least 10 of these guys here. So the way, or 12, let's say. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to make a new null object, and I'm going to put 2 slider effectors on this. So here's a slider control, and this one I'll rename text size, and another one I'm going to put on there, and this one I'll name text spacing. Okay, great. And because I'm basically going to have to create a bunch of these numbers by duplicating layers, and this will really help out a lot for me to line them up against these edges. So let's get started here. So if you go into our text layer here, really there is no default text size just for the transform layer. So what I'm going to do is go to the Animate here and add scale. Okay, this will be a good animation link to the slider control here. Let me lock down my slider control. And if I go into the scale here, option click, then pick whip that to the slider for the text size. So what this is going to allow me to do is I can now control the scale of this thing based on my slider. Now one thing I don't want it to do is sort of scale per each number. So if I go into my more options here, I'm going to do it by line. Okay, so now if I do it that way, it does the full 4-digit number, not individual numbers. Okay, great. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to link the Y position here, okay, to the text spacing. But before I do that, I'm going to put in here index times, and then I'll pick whip the slider for text spacing. So what this is going to do is it's going to basically increase every time I duplicate to the distance between each duplicate. So for example, if I duplicate this so many amount of times, maybe like 10 times, I can go ahead and use my slider now to create distances between them. So in conjunction with the size of this, I take all of these as well and pick whip them to the null. I can also use that null to align these things. So I'll move this part here like so. Make the let's make the text a little smaller. And now I can use the slider to basically align these up right on the edge here. So I might need to come up here a little more, kind of push this to the center of this callout, and then if I go to the bottom here, I should be able to, by using text spacing, kind of push that there. So now we've got them all kind of lined up. So what I will do is I'm going to duplicate all this. So I'm going to grab all of these except for my callouts, a layer precompose, and call them C for callouts numbers. Okay, now if I duplicate this, I don't need to worry about it being linked. That's fine that it is, and I'll just move it to the other side, kind of eyeballing it so it's aligned. Great. Now if I go back into original here, let me shut down these other compositions. Now I have the same thing basically happening here, but now I have some numbers here that are also randomizing as they animate. Here it is in full speed here. Great. So now these numbers, they're moving kind of fast. So again, this is pretty flexible. So I can go back into, for example, each of my callouts, the upper and the lower. So I'll start with the upper here. And maybe what I can do is push these. So maybe I'll take this second keyframe and push it out to maybe about 4. And do the same thing on the other set of callouts. Just make these things move a little slower. Let's do a quick playback here. Great. So now they're moving just a little bit slower here. Okay, so let's keep adding some more elements here. So one of the things I'll add is sort of these center elements here, starting with some of these circles and lines, and eventually I'll use a ruler here as well. So let's go ahead and do that, all with shape layers. So I'm going to click on my ellipse tool, set my color to like a bright teal, light blue, 2 stroke, double click. So what this does is it puts perfect oval. I'll make it smaller here, maybe like 100 by 100, lock it down. And now I can sort of use that, if I size it up a little bit, as like a focus element in the center here. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit less in terms of its stroke width. So then I'll use this same, I'll rename the shape layers as, I'll call this center elements. And I'll just add a couple more in there. Inside the center elements, I'm going to make another group here. So I'm going to go to add group, and this one I will rename as half circles, perhaps. Okay, so in here I'm going to basically grab another ellipse, and it will also be affected by the stroke here. So here I'm simply going to apply a trim paths to this. Okay, and on the trim paths, let's set this to maybe 10% for the start, 40% for the end. And what we have basically is just a segment of that circle here. Okay, looks good. And to finish this little section off, let's go ahead and add a repeater in here as well. This time I'll go ahead and make 2 copies, and perhaps on the repeater transform, I'll reset my position X and do a -100 on the scale on the X. So if I click away, I should have just a small segment like that. Stroke here, let's just make this white so that it's going to be more neutral, because I'm going to add a couple of other color segments in here a little bit later on. So for right now, let's just leave it at white. Okay, and then finally, maybe I'll just add one more circle in here. So just grab another ellipse, and this one I'll just make the size small. The good thing about this is that all of these, no matter what size, all of these elements here are centered and working with the same stroke. Play this back. We have something that looks like that. Now let's go ahead and do this sort of sideways horizontal line here. So let's get that set up. Again, working with shape layers, I'll just grab pen tool, make a straight line like that. Let's go ahead and change its color to white. And by default, it should be, even though it's off center, it still technically is centered because the anchor point is there. So I can continue kind of working with my center elements here, and if I need to move this closer to the middle, I'll just drag its path, and I'll bring it into right about there, so it's overlapping that center element. And same thing we did before. If I want to have 2 of these things, I will just go into my path, or actually I can also do a repeater as well. So add repeater. This way it'll be easier just to line things up, and maybe I'll keep things organized. I'll do a new group. So let's put this group under contents. Let's call this horizontal lines, and in here I will drag the path, and I will drag the stroke in there as well. So now we've got all these elements lined up properly here, and there I can put a repeater, and this already has a repeater. So let's just go ahead and move this a little bit to a different hierarchy so that the repeater is right around there. Okay, so again, we'll do the same thing we always do. Make this 2 copies, transform the repeater 0 out the position, and then minus 100 on the X scale. And you don't see anything, and that is because there is no stroke to this. So let's go ahead and bring a stroke element here and make sure we got that in our folder. Somehow that got deleted, or it could be buried somewhere, but just make sure you have it on the outside. Now I'm going to add these sort of horizontal, or rather vertical elements here. So let's go ahead and work on those. So let me twirl this H lines up, and in that same contents for shape layer 1 here, let me go ahead and rename this. Let's call these H elements. And I will, in my contents, add another vertical stroke. So I'll just click here and here. And let's call this vertical lines. Let's try to center it up on the y-axis, so as close as we can here. And we'll go ahead and make this thicker as well. So I'm going to increase the stroke width so it's slightly more thick, or not slightly, but significantly more thick than the horizontal line. I'll just move this down a little bit. And just like we did before, I'm going to go ahead and use the repeater on this. So I'll grab the repeater, make sure, sometimes it gets placed in a weird area, make sure that it's indeed inside the V lines and also last right above vertical lines. Again, I'm going to set the copies to 2, transform the repeater 0 out position, you guessed it, minus 100 on the X scale. So the reason why I'm doing it this way is now, watch what happens. I'm going to grab another library item here called wiggle and transform, and make sure this is after the repeater, and I can get rid of fill here, by the way. I can go ahead and for the wiggle transform, it has its own transform. I can, for example, crank up the position X value, and what happens is that it's going to apply a randomness to both of these separately. So if I hit play right now, see they're moving independently of each other. This is a much quicker way than trying to do this with keyframes for my experimenting with this. So here you can control a couple of things. You can control the speed. So if you want to bring this down to 100 to 1 wiggle per second, just slow it down. We can do that as well. Also, some of these values are kind of interesting to play around with. For example, correlation will follow how closely they mimic each other. So if I crank this up, they might move relatively at the same time. If I lower that, they move much more independently from each other. Great. So I can also do this whole exact same thing. For example, I can duplicate this, Command D, and rather than having vertical lines, I can instead add a polystar, and I can get rid of my paths here. Polystar, let's go ahead and make that into 3 points, which is kind of like a triangle. From my experience, you can mess around with these, but the easier option would be right-click on polystar path, convert to Bezier. It limits the amount of values to keep things relatively simple, and to also edit our triangle here, I just made it into a path. So for example, I can make this smaller, rotate it, and even go into my path here. I can actually bring in a fill. So let's get rid of the stroke. Let's go ahead and make the fill also like a sort of muted gray, perhaps. We'll make this smaller. Okay, and let me turn off the repeater for 1 second here so I can work with this. And maybe what I'll do is I'll move let me turn this off as well. I'm going to turn off my wiggle transform as well. So maybe what I'll do is I'll move this whole thing. Be careful where you're dragging to the left here. Let's make it smaller still. I'll bring it down my arrow keys and to the left. Maybe like so. Okay, click away. And now if I apply the repeater and the wiggle transform, now we have another element that kind of goes along with that thick vertical line there. This one I can play around with as well. For example, in the transform, maybe I'll make these faster. Let's say 2 wiggles per second, and I can even make them go out more. So perhaps something like that. Decrease the correlation so they're moving much more independently. And it's a little bit too fast. Let's bring this to 1.25 maybe. Okay, great. Maybe while I'm here, I can go to I'll rename this triangles. And maybe on the vertical lines, if you go to the stroke options, I'll change this to round cap. And maybe I'll make them a little bit smaller as well. Again, the best way to do that is just turn off temporarily the repeater and the wiggle transform. That way it'll give you a much clearer view. So I'll just move these closer together. Okay, just remember to turn it back on. And now we have something that looks like this. Alright, so we're kind of getting there. Next, I'm going to add these vertical teal lines here. So let's try that. Okay, so again, I'll grab my pen tool. Let's make it teal. It's got like an electric teal. And I'll just start off with just drawing one right here. Same exact thing as you might have guessed before. I can basically duplicate some of these and kind of line up one side here. So if I click on path, I'll move this one here. Maybe I'll make this one smaller. And I'll bring closer together to the other one. Duplicate the original one again. And let's move it to the right, down a little bit. Let's make it touch that arc. And maybe bring the other two closer together. Great. Now, just as we did before, I want to make a duplicate this on the other side. So our friend, best friend, the repeater, yet again. And again, we'll just do 2 copies. 0 out position, -100 on the X. Great. Now we have something that looks like this. And I'm going to extend out a couple of things. And one of the reasons why I like working with a repeater this way is that if I do decide to make a change, like for example, let's say I want to make this longer, both sides get equally affected. So it's a good shortcut rather than doing all this sort of manually. Okay, there we go. So now we have something kind of looks like that. Okay, so I'm going to keep adding more elements. Let's call these vertical elements, which is basically these lines. All right, let's move this down a little bit. Next, I'm going to add these sort of ruler tick marks here. You can probably guess how I'm going to do that. Seems pretty simple, so I'm just going to grab my pen tool, make a small horizontal line to the side here. Let's call this ruler element. And just as we have done many times before, I'm going to do a repeater. Zero out the position, minus 100 on the X scale, and there it is. So what happens now is if I move these closer together, they will eventually line up down in the center. Something perhaps like that. And if I need to, I can make these less long here. And maybe move them closer together. Great. So I'm going to move this all the way sort of towards the top here. And I'll add another repeater. This time I'm going to zero out the X position, but increase the Y. And depending on how much of a distance you want between them, maybe something like that, I can increase my copies and bring this all the way down perhaps. Great. So maybe I'll lower the opacity of this whole thing. If I go into my shape here, there's a transform for that shape and there's no opacity there. Bring that down so it's not quite so prominent there. And it'd be kind of cool if I can make these things also move just like these other these sort of callouts. So let's try that. Again, this is going to be just another way to create a tileable, loopable element here. So I'll go ahead and immediately pre-compose this. Call it ruler. Double click, and just as I have done before. Oh, one thing I'm noticing is that these are not the same opacity, so let me fix that immediately here. And that's just because if I go into my transform here, let me crank this up. So, and the way I'm going to get rid of that is just I'm not going to mess with it. I'll just do that on the layer level, so it affects the whole thing. Okay, cool. And now I can grab that same point of interest tool. Well, actually, let me backtrack a little bit here. Let me go ahead and raise this up so it's going outside of my range on top here. And I will, in fact, now grab some more rulers. And I'll do that same trick where I'm basically trying to make guides here for my point of interest to actually crop. So if I do something like this, let me unlock the guides. Okay, about halfway between these marks. I'll do that same thing on the bottommost element, kind of like right there. Okay, then I'll lock the guides. Grab my region of interest, and again I'll do a rough box like this. Then I'll go in here and align this to my guides here and here. And now I can move these closer together, perhaps. Great. So this should be perfectly tileable. Composition, crop, comp to region of interest. Great. X out of this. And I should be pretty much ready to go to offset this. And what I can simply do, by the way, I can copy. If I go to the upper call out here, I might be able to get away with just copying my shift center to in the offset. So if I grab this whole thing, Command C, and then go to my ruler element, hit Command V. Okay, now it gets a little bit off center, but it still saves me some time. I can simply align that back up, and when I do that, now these guys move pretty much in sync. I'll just center it up. So now they kind of go along with each other. One thing though is I kind of want to make this go all the way to the top, so I'm going to move that up a little bit, and now it goes from the top to bottom. Now, I'm not going to worry about this section because this section will eventually fade. Okay, so that's why I'm not going to make it go all the way towards the bottom here. Okay, great. So the way I'm going to do this is with a stencil layer. So if I have, for example, a new solid here, doesn't matter what color, just make it gray, whatever. And if I apply an effect called gradient ramp, okay, what happens is that I have just a black to white gradient here. So I'm going to swap colors here, so it's going from white to black, and I'm going to use this as a stencil luma. What's going to happen is areas that are closer to white are going to be more opaque, and areas that are closer to black are going to be transparent. So if I play this back, it kind of fades out at the end there. Okay, and what I'm going to do here as well is I'm going to move my adjustment layer on top of everything except for the gray solid to bring up some of those colors and the glow. Okay, it looks pretty good. Everything's sort of fading out here with my stencil layer here. So just keep in mind this is what this is. Set to stencil luma. And again, I can play around with this. For example, if I click on the gradient effect, if I wanted to bring more of these colors towards the center into opacity, I can move this down, and these still go into the fade while it's more prominent and visible here. Great. Okay. Finally, what I'll do is I'll add this sort of last element here, and that's just like these little accents here. So I'm going to go yet again into my shape tools. Let's grab a rectangle, double click on it, perfect rectangle. Let's make it small and bring it down towards the bottom. So if I position this on the Y like so, make it smaller still. And then I'll convert this into Bezier path. The main reason for that is I can use that to break open this rectangle layer unclosed, and now I can move these down a little bit. Maybe move the whole thing down. Okay, and here at the bottom we'll just have a couple of rectangles that move randomly, or not rectangles, but triangles that move randomly. So let's do that. So I'm going to come in here. Again, I'll bring in a polygon. Maybe I'll make this three-sided to get a triangle. Much smaller. So let me bring this. And again, the way I like to do this is I could definitely mess with the outer radius, and I can bring this down and all that. Maybe move this down in position. And don't need a stroke, but I do need fill. Same color though. And now I can make the make this even smaller. And let's just bring this down so it's right over that line, maybe like that, and smaller still. Now, repeater. This time we will do 2 copies and zero out the x, but instead of doing it on the scale of -100 on the x, we'll do a -100 on the y. And you'll see a triangle all the way up here. We do want to mimic or mirror this, but I don't want it this high, so then what I'll do is just bring this down back to here. And then maybe we'll make this one smaller than the other one. So if I go to the, again, I'm going to transform the repeater, lock down the scale, bring this smaller, and push the position. Okay, so now we've got, let's make this smaller still. And bring this back up. Cool. And then here again, we can apply wiggle transform after the repeater. And also on the X position, we have these guys move around. Just kind of do their thing. Now that's way too much. Let's bring this down. And let's even more than that. I don't want to go outside that box. And let's slow this down to 0.5. So it's kind of doing its thing. Now maybe here I can crank up the correlation a little bit, so they're kind of following each other better. Almost like there's some kind of a measurements, balance measurement or something going on there. Let's make this back to 1. Let's bring it, speed up a little bit. Great. So let's take a look at this from the full view here. Okay, that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll make this make it a little faster. So that pretty much wraps it up. The other thing that I'm missing here is just this vertical line in the middle. That's pretty simple to do, obviously. I'll just draw a vertical line. So somewhere on top here, I'll make it white. Draw a vertical line. And I should be able to snap it towards the center. Click on the path. Now, if I want this to fade with everything else, I'll just put this below the gray solid here. Now, I purposely didn't put these guys, the 2 triangles here, because I want them to be visible. So that's why they're above the gray solid. So let's play this back in full speed and full view here as well. Okay, so one last thing we can do is I can again go to my adjustment layer, maybe duplicate the glow, lower the intensity, maybe increase the radius, and now I have a slightly more visible, noticeable kind of intensity here for my entire widget here. Okay, great. So like, subscribe, comment, and I'll make more of these. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Revenge MoGraph, Motion Graphics Reverse Engineered.